Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, as the wind sighs against the glass and the flame trembles low, we invite you into another tale of suspense and candlelight. Let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. It began, as many curious things in St. Mary Mead did, with a letter slipped beneath Miss Marple's front door. The envelope was cream-coloured, its edges slightly smudged by gloved fingers, and it bore the faintest scent of lavender and smoke. "Colonel and Mrs. Havisham request the pleasure of your company this Christmas Eve," it read in a slanting, hurried hand. Miss Marple, seated beside her parlour fire, tilted her head. The Colonel, she knew, was not one for hasty writing, nor for lavender paper. She laid the card gently upon the table beside her knitting and murmured, "Curious indeed. Either Mrs. Havisham is suddenly fond of social effort, or something rather odd has occurred." Outside, the church bells chimed 6, muffled by falling snow. The village lanes were soft and white, and already the talk had begun, of gifts, of choir rehearsals, and of Emily Carter's sudden engagement to a young man from London. "A banker," Mrs. Linton had said, though with a tone that suggested suspicion rather than admiration. Miss Marple, tucking her shawl around her shoulders, thought she might attend the gathering after all, for Christmas was not merely a time of good cheer. It was a time when truth, long hidden, had a way of coming to light, like a candle rekindled after a draught. The Havisham house stood at the end of the lane, its gables outlined in pale frost, its windows glowing gold against the night. Inside, laughter mingled with the faint notes of a piano and the scent of clove and cinnamon. Miss Marple was greeted warmly by Mrs. Havisham, though the woman's smile trembled slightly, as though held together by politeness rather than joy. "My dear Miss Marple, how lovely of you to come," she said, pressing her hands together. "Do make yourself comfortable. The Colonel insists on serving his famous punch." Miss Marple inclined her head with a gentle smile. "Ah, yes, the Colonel's punch. A village tradition, I believe. Indeed it was." Every year the Colonel prided himself on his mixture of spice and warmth, a recipe kept secret since his service days in India. Yet as Miss Marple accepted her glass, she noticed the faintest furrow between his brows. His wife hovered nearby, wringing her lace handkerchief, and the Colonel, red-faced and jovial as ever, seemed to force each laugh as though it cost him dearly. In a corner near the mantel stood Emily Carter, radiant in white silk and pearls, her fiancé beside her, a tall, smooth-spoken fellow with eyes too quick to wander. They made a striking pair, though something in his expression, a flash of calculation perhaps, made Miss Marple's knitting fingers twitch. Nearby, Mrs. Linton whispered to Reverend Leonard's wife, "Mark my words, dear, that man's fortune isn't half what he claims. He's after Emily's inheritance, you'll see." Miss Marple didn't interrupt, of course, she rarely did, but she noted the remark quietly, as one might mark a pattern in a piece of lace, knowing it would matter later. She sipped her punch, light and festive, though her keen senses caught a faint bitterness beneath the sweetness. "Cold night, eh, Miss Marple?" said the Colonel, appearing beside her. "A fine turnout, wouldn't you say? The village could use a bit of cheer." "Indeed," said Miss Marple kindly, her eyes resting on the empty punch ladle. "Though I must say that last cup went quickly," he chuckled. "Aye, my secret recipe. No one makes it quite like me." But when he raised his own glass and took a hearty swallow, Miss Marple saw him wince. Only for a moment. A tightening of the jaw, a shadow in the eyes, but enough for her to notice. The moment passed, the conversation shifted, and the laughter resumed. Yet the impression lingered. By 9 o'clock the snow outside had thickened to a soft curtain. The fire crackled, the lights gleamed, and Mrs. Havisham's smile grew stiffer by the minute. Emily and her fiancé danced a slow waltz, the Colonel leaning heavily in his armchair. His face, Miss Marple thought, looked pale beneath its ruddy complexion. The maid, a young girl named Elsie, moved about the room collecting empty glasses. Miss Marple noticed how she avoided looking at her master, her hands trembling slightly as she passed him by. When the clock struck 9, the sound seemed to shiver through the air like glass. The Colonel stirred, made as if to rise, then slumped back, his glass slipping from his hand. It struck the carpet without sound. A brief, terrible silence followed. Then came Mrs. Havisham's cry. The guests rushed forward. The Reverend knelt beside the fallen man, pressing fingers to his neck. "Fetch a doctor," someone shouted. Miss Marple remained where she stood, her eyes calm but sharp, watching the scene unfold as though each movement were a line in a story she had read before. Mrs. Havisham's tears came quickly, perhaps too quickly. The maid turned away, her apron pressed to her face, and Miss Marple, bending slightly, noticed a faint, lingering scent. Almonds, unmistakable, delicate, and deadly. The doctor arrived, breathless from the snow, and declared that the Colonel's heart had failed. "A shock, no doubt," he murmured, shaking his head. "He was not a young man." "Indeed," said Miss Marple quietly, "and yet he seemed so robust." She looked around the room, the punch bowl half empty, the cups scattered like clues upon a chessboard. Mrs. Havisham clutched her handkerchief as if it were her only lifeline. Emily stood pale and speechless, while her fiancé comforted her with one hand and glanced nervously toward the door. Later that evening, as Miss Marple walked home through the hush of falling snow, the world seemed unnaturally still. The candles in cottage windows burned low. The church clock struck 10. She paused beneath the holly arch that framed her gate and thought of the Colonel's glass, his wince, and the faint, bitter scent that lingered still in her memory. Inside her cosy parlour, she placed her knitting on her lap and looked toward the flickering fire. "Poison," she said softly, almost kindly. And at Christmas, too, the clock ticked gently in reply. Miss Marple smiled faintly, knowing that beneath the peace of St. Mary Mead, a darker story was beginning to unfold, one that would lead her, stitch by stitch, to the truth. Chapter 2. There was a curious hush in St. Mary Mead the next morning, the sort of hush that follows a snowfall and a scandal. Doors opened a fraction, curtains lifted a finger's width, and voices, when they spoke at all, dropped as if the very hedgerows might overhear. "They say it was shock," Mrs. Linton confided to the butcher's wife at 9:30, "but I never yet saw shock that smelt faintly of almonds." The butcher's wife pressed her lips together and concluded that speaking less was safest. Only her eyes, bright with village knowledge, said otherwise. Miss Marple, having finished her porridge and written a brief note to her nephew Raymond, wrapped a warm shawl over her shoulders and examined the neat basket on her table. Within sat a proper casserole, the sort of kindly offering that opens a grieving door quicker than a constable's knock. She set off along the lane toward the Havisham house, her boots leaving tidy prints that a less tidy mind might have called clues. The sky was a pale winter blue. Her thoughts, however, held deeper shades. At the gate, she paused. A sprig of mistletoe had been tied to the knocker with a scarlet ribbon. Cheerful, if one did not know what had happened. Miss Marple's eyes rested upon the knot, hastily tied, ends uneven. Someone had done it in a flurry. She noted the small thing and tapped lightly. After a moment the door opened to reveal Elsie, the maid, her face paler than the snowbank beside the step. She curtsied at once, then remembered, belatedly, to murmur condolences. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "I've brought a little supper against your mistress's weariness. These days are cruelly long." Elsie blinked. "Thank you, Ma'am. If you'll come in, only Mrs. Havisham is lying down. The doctor said she must rest." "Very sensible," Miss Marple replied. Rest is a doctor's finest prescription when no one wishes to hear what he truly thinks. The remark, so mild it could have been a lullaby, made Elsie look up sharply. Then she stepped aside. In the hall, the scent of yesterday's spices lingered, clove and orange, and beneath it, just a ghost, that almond note that had startled Miss Marple at the party. She did not sniff like a hound, that would have been unseemly, but the air told its quiet tale. On the console table lay a handkerchief, lacy and damp at one corner. Beside it, a dark smear marred the wood, a bruise of spilled wine or punch. Miss Marple's gaze settled on the handkerchief's embroidered initial, H, for Havisham, or perhaps for something else that would present itself in time. They went into the morning room. The fire had been coaxed back to life, and Mrs. Havisham, propped against cushions, rose too quickly in agitation. "Miss Marple, how very kind." The poor woman's words quivered at the edges, and though her eyes were wet, there was a tightness at the mouth that spoke of fear as much as sorrow. Miss Marple's own expression was a masterpiece of comfort. She set the covered dish on a trivet, fussed about plates, and produced a small thermos of tea no one had requested, but everyone needed. "The village sends its love," she murmured. "They will talk, of course, but love will out-talk even gossip when it chooses." "Gossip," Mrs. Havisham repeated faintly, pressing the handkerchief to her lips. "There is nothing to gossip about." It was his heart. The doctor said, "Doctors," Miss Marple said, pouring tea with a steady hand, "say what is most merciful in the moment. I am speaking of neighbours who say what they think will be most discussed." A quite different profession. A glossy silence followed, polite, fragile. In that silence, Miss Marple noticed Elsie's hands, reddened from work but trembling now with more than cold. The girl made for the door, then hesitated, eyes fixed on the casserole as if it might explode. "I'll bring plates," she said, and fled. "Dear child," Miss Marple said softly. "Nerves make everything worse, don't they?" She turned her mild gaze back to Mrs. Havisham. "How is your strength this morning?" "It comes and goes," Mrs. Havisham's voice frayed. "Last night, last night." One moment he was laughing, the next she stopped and put a shaking hand to her throat. "I feel as if the house itself were listening." "Then let it listen," Miss Marple replied with unexpected firmness. "Walls have heard more dreadful truths and survived them. Tell me what troubles you most." Mrs. Havisham looked at the fire. "The letter," she whispered. "It arrived the day before the party. No signature. Only a warning." "Nonsense, of course." "Yet I slept not at all." "A warning," Miss Marple murmured, as though discussing the weather. "And written in a hand you did not know?" "A cramped hand like someone writing in a hurry." She drew a breath. "It said that truths would come to light before Christmas morning." A horrid, theatrical turn of phrase. "Useful, nevertheless," said Miss Marple. "Theatrical turns of phrase draw attention to themselves, and the sender must have meant precisely that." Elsie returned with plates. Her sleeve brushed the mantel, and a photograph slipped and tilted. Only a fraction, but Miss Marple's head turned. The summer picnic portrait. Even at a slant, it was quite clear the Colonel's hand rested on a young woman's shoulder, not his wife's. Had Miss Marple not seen the picture last night, she would have seen it now. "Leave it, dear," Miss Marple said when Elsie fumbled to straighten it. "The world is a little skewed for us all this morning." They ate a few dutiful bites. Tea soothed throats that had done too much protesting. Presently the door opened and Reverend Leonard came in, dusting snow from his hat. He was a kind man and clever enough never to announce it. After his murmured condolences, he accepted a cup, and his eyes, which saw nearly as much as Miss Marple's, flicked to the mantel frame and then to Mrs. Havisham's strained face. "I am here as a friend," he said gently, "and to say, if there is any business, any worldly business, you would wish me to know, I am at your service." Mrs. Havisham's fingers tightened on the handkerchief. "There is nothing, only papers and the will." "Oh, how vile to speak of such a thing today, but it was altered. Only last week." The words escaped like frightened birds, and having flown, she could not call them back. He said it made matters simpler. Miss Marple's knitting mind, always purling under the surface, turned a quiet row. "Simplicity," she said, "is a reassuring word. It often means a great deal of complication has been cleared from one path onto another." Mrs. Havisham's eyes filled again. He removed a distant cousin from the provisions. "A difficult woman." "There were quarrels in the summer. She made a scene at our garden party." "Oh, it was dreadful." "Miss Clara?" Reverend Leonard ventured. "No, no," Mrs. Havisham said quickly, almost too quickly. "Clara is family. It was my husband's cousin, Agatha Merriweather. She has a temper and a memory for slights." Miss Marple folded a napkin with unnecessary neatness. A quarrelsome cousin excised from a will could hardly fail to produce drama of the noisy sort. Yet last night's drama had been quiet, odourless to most, scented to those who knew. "Did your husband tell many people of the alteration?" she asked, as if the point were trifling. "He told no one," Mrs. Havisham said, and then amended. "Only Mr. Barlow, the solicitor, of course. And perhaps he boasted at the club. Men are apt to treat serious things as triumphs there." "How very true," Miss Marple said, as though speaking of puddings. A log shifted in the grate. Outside, a sparrow made an optimistic chirp. Inside, the morning room contracted about them with the peculiar closeness of houses where something grim has happened. Miss Marple lifted the teapot, and with the precision that made her so beloved by careful souls, topped up each cup exactly to the line. "There is one small matter," she added, almost apologetically. "At the fete last month, your niece mentioned that your cook had left. I was sorry to hear it." "Did she leave abruptly?" "In a huff," Mrs. Havisham said despairingly. "Over nonsense. She accused Elsie of meddling in the kitchen when my back was turned." "I hardly believed it, but, well, cooks are particular." "Very," Miss Marple said. "And a vacated kitchen is as inviting as an unlocked drawer to anyone inclined to experiment." Elsie's tray rattled. "I never—" she began, then bit her lip. Miss Marple did not look up, which was kind of her. Sometimes politeness is the only curtain people have left to hide behind. Instead, she set down her cup and rose. "I wonder," she said lightly, "if I might step to the larder for a moment and wash my hands. I am a great believer in soap." The larder was cool and orderly. On an upper shelf stood a row of spices, nutmeg, clove, cinnamon, each in its jar with a neat label. Only the nutmeg jar was not quite where it ought to be. Its neighbour cinnamon had crooked itself to fill a gap. Miss Marple's fingertips found a faint dusting along the wood, recently disturbed. On the far counter, a lemon, half-used, had been abandoned, with its cut face turned down. Beneath it lay a scrap of paper with writing smeared by juice. She did not touch it. Some things are best left for official hands. Yet she stooped to read the unsmeared edge. 2 words, "secret ingredient," and then a line that might have been a price or a reminder. Miss Marple's mouth settled into its most thoughtful line. She rejoined them with her usual mildness. "Lemons do brighten a winter kitchen," she observed to no one in particular, "and lists brighten a winter mind. I am partial to both." Then, turning back to Mrs. Havisham, she asked, as though the idea had only just occurred, "My dear, may I inquire, did you or the Colonel drink tea last night before the guests departed?" "Tea?" Mrs. Havisham blinked. "I think I asked for it later when the doctor came," she faltered, then steadied herself. "But I had none. Everything tasted of, oh, how foolish I am, of fear." "Fear does flavour things," Miss Marple said, "and sometimes frightens away the taste one ought to notice." Her eyes rested on the mantel photograph again, on the hand that spoke of summer companionship. It was not a scolding look. It was the look of a woman who has seen much and judged little, but arranged a good deal in her head without announcing it. There came a knock at the front door. Voices filtered along the passage, a brisk baritone, a murmured reply. Mr. Barlow, the solicitor, was shown in, a tidy man with careful hair, and a briefcase that might as well have been labelled "Consequence." He bowed to Mrs. Havisham and sat, perching on the edge, as if he feared to weigh too heavily upon grief. "I shall be brief," he said. "There are practicalities that cannot wait. The will, for instance." His gaze ticked just once toward Miss Marple, then back. "I have been told there may be—" "Questions." Miss Marple's blue eyes were as innocent as sky. "Questions are the soul of housekeeping," she said amiably, "and of justice too, I dare say." "I wonder, did you bring a copy of the alteration?" He hesitated, then inclined his head. "A memorandum only." "The official document is sealed." He produced a paper, and Mrs. Havisham looked at it as if it might bite. "The cousin Agatha is removed. Provision made for Miss Clara Harcourt is maintained." The pause around the niece's name was meaningful to ears tuned for such music. "There are also small bequests for staff." "Small bequests can loom very large," Miss Marple murmured. She thanked Mr. Barlow as though he had handed her a slice of cake and not a sliver of danger. Then she drew on her gloves. "I will leave you to your necessary duties. Mrs. Havisham, you have been brave. Take the tea. It will be a friend when others are merely visitors." In the hall, Elsie walked her to the door. The girl's eyes brimmed, but what spilled out was anger rather than tears.
"They'll blame me," she said in a rush.
"Cooks do and ladies do, and now with him gone, they'll say it was my fault." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the girl's sleeve. "Only those who know too little speak too quickly. Be tidy and be truthful, Elsie, and you will do very well." Her glance flicked down the corridor toward the pantry.
"And if there is anything you moved last night, any small thing you put to rights, tell the constable plainly when he asks."
It is better to say a foolish truth than a clever silence. Outside, snow squeaked underfoot. The village lay innocent in its white shawl, but the day had gathered a darker thread. At the corner, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Linton, who leaned in without preamble.
"They say the will was changed," she breathed, savouring each word like a boiled sweet.
"And they say a certain cousin is cut out entirely."
"Imagine the temper."
"If you ask me, there's your motive, plain as holly on a church door." "Dear Mrs. Linton," Miss Marple said, "motives are like mince pies. There are always more than one, and some are filled with surprises." She walked on, untroubled by the cold, warmed instead by the quiet click of deduction settling into place. A hurried hand with a warning letter, a kitchen neatened by the wrong person, a photograph that told a summer story, a will that had redrawn winter fortunes, and floating over it all, the delicate, dreadful scent that did not belong at Christmas. When she reached her gate, she paused beneath the holly and looked back at the lane. A solitary figure, Emily Carter, was moving briskly toward the Havisham house, head bent, steps too fast for a morning of condolence. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, not unkindly. She had a sudden image of a young woman standing by a punch bowl, insisting cheerfully upon a secret ingredient. Then she saw, superimposed upon that image, a shelf where cinnamon had edged itself into the place of something else. "Well now," Miss Marple murmured.
"That is interesting." She went inside and set the teapot to boil again.
Her knitting lay where she had left it, needles crossed like quiet swords. As she drew yarn through yarn, the soft rhythm matched the murmur of her thoughts. Somewhere between mistletoe and memorandum, between a trembling maid and a tidy larder, the outline of truth was beginning to show, faint, like a pencil sketch beneath a watercolour wash, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the next darker shadow of murder. Chapter 3. The morning light in St. Mary Mead fell pale and cold, filtered through a veil of mist that seemed to soften every outline, except, of course, the outlines in people's stories. Those grew sharper by the hour. At the post office, Miss Hartnell declared that the Colonel had always been a hearty man, but too fond of his secrets. And at the grocer's, Mrs. Linton confided that she had heard there was a letter. No one could quite say who had read it or what it said, but they agreed that it must have been dreadful. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was not given to speculation. She preferred observation, the quiet kind, with a cup of tea and an open ear. That morning, she called upon the Reverend Leonard under the pretence of returning a borrowed hymn book, and found him by the study fire, polishing his spectacles with unnecessary vigour. "My dear Miss Marple,"
he exclaimed, rising at once.
"the village is in an uproar. You cannot imagine the tales being told." "I can, and likely more than you've heard," she replied gently, seating herself near the hearth. "People seldom lie entirely, Reverend, they simply embroider." He smiled ruefully. "Then the pattern grows more tangled by the minute. Between ourselves, the postman confided something peculiar about a letter the Colonel received before the party. Came by the midday post, he said. Mrs. Havisham was with him when he opened it, and she turned white as linen. Wouldn't you call that curious?" "I would," Miss Marple murmured, stirring her tea. "Curious things have a way of arriving by post, particularly those written in haste." The Reverend sighed.
"He meant to show it to me on Sunday, but—"
His words faltered. "Seems he never had the chance." or never wished to, Miss Marple said softly. There's a difference, you know. That afternoon, as the church bells tolled 3, Miss Marple made her way once more to the Havisham house. She was expected now. Grief often welcomes company that speaks in quiet tones and asks no direct questions. Mrs. Havisham received her in a dimly lit sitting room, the curtains drawn as though sunlight itself were indecent. A fire burned low in the grate, its warmth doing little to reach the corners. "My dear, you are kind to come," Mrs. Havisham murmured, her voice thin as thread. "The days are endless, wherein the nights—"
"Indeed," Miss Marple said, settling her shawl.
"Night always enlarges our thoughts like candlelight reflected in a window. You told me before of a letter."
"Might I ask, have you found it?"
Mrs. Havisham hesitated. Her hand drifted to a writing desk beside the window.
"I have it still," she whispered.
"I cannot bring myself to destroy it." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her eyes brightened slightly. "Perhaps reading it once more might ease your mind." The widow drew a deep breath and opened a small drawer. From within, she withdrew a single sheet of thick paper, creased and faintly stained at one corner. She handed it to Miss Marple with trembling fingers. The handwriting was bold but uneven, a man's, perhaps written in haste. The message was brief. "There are truths that will come to light before Christmas morning. You cannot hide what you have done." No signature, no address. Merely those words, each stroke heavy with intent. Miss Marple folded the paper again, very neatly. "No postmark?" she asked. "None. Was delivered by hand." "The postman swears he never touched it." Miss Marple looked up. "Then whoever sent it knew your habits and your household, and wished it to be read before your guests arrived." Mrs. Havisham shivered. "Do you think it was meant for me, Miss Marple, or for my husband?" "Letters of accusation," Miss Marple said softly, "are often written for an audience of 2. But one of them is seldom meant to live long enough to answer." The widow turned away, her breath catching. As tea was brought in, Miss Marple noticed that the maid, Elsie, was not the one carrying the tray today. Instead, it was Clara Harcourt, the niece. She was a handsome woman in her late 20s, with auburn hair and a complexion that could turn from charm to chill in an instant. "My aunt tires easily," she said, placing the tray with a firmness that suggested impatience. "The house has been insufferable since the tragedy. I told her we mustn't let the villagers talk us into hysteria." "Ah," said Miss Marple mildly, "the villagers do so enjoy a story. Still, they usually tell a truer one than the papers." Clara gave a small laugh, though it lacked warmth. "Well, I'm sure they'll make me the villain soon enough. They always do." Miss Marple's needles, she had brought her knitting, of course, clicked softly. "Villainy, my dear, is often a matter of timing.
One moment too soon or too late, and one is suddenly to blame." Clara's lips tightened.
"Then let us hope I'm punctual." She swept out, leaving a faint trace of almond scent in her wake.
"Not strong, merely a suggestion, like memory."
Miss Marple's gaze followed her to the door, thoughtful. Later, as the afternoon dimmed into early dusk, Miss Marple requested to see the Colonel's study. Mrs. Havisham hesitated but finally agreed, leading her down a narrow passage lined with hunting prints. The study smelled faintly of tobacco and old books, with a half-empty decanter of brandy on the desk. "Nothing has been touched," Mrs. Havisham whispered. "Good," Miss Marple replied, her eyes sweeping the room. On the desk lay a fountain pen, its nib darkened, and beside it a small inkwell, recently used. She noticed, too, a folded sheet beneath a paperweight, part of a letter unfinished. The words visible read,
"Cannot allow this to go on. The risk is too great."
"Clara must—" The rest was obscured by the weight. Miss Marple did not lift it. She simply looked at the faint indentation on the blotting paper, and her mouth curved slightly. "Your husband was a careful man," she said. Even in anger he paused before naming a cause. Mrs. Havisham swallowed. He and Clara had argued that afternoon.
"Over money, I believe."
"She has had difficulties." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "Difficulties often find the most convenient timing." As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused in the hallway. On a small table near the door lay a lace handkerchief, not Mrs. Havisham's usual one, for this bore a stitched initial C. It was faintly scented. She leaned closer. The perfume was almond again, but sweeter now, disguised by rosewater. She replaced it carefully. "A lovely pattern," she murmured. "Cross-stitch, if I'm not mistaken."
Difficult to keep clean. The widow looked puzzled.
"It belongs to Clara, I think." "She leaves them everywhere." "Yes," said Miss Marple, smiling softly. Everywhere indeed. Outside, the air bit cold against her cheeks as she walked home through the lane. The snow had hardened to a glittering crust. Her steps made a crisp rhythm against it. The village lamps were already lit, glowing faintly through the fog. Somewhere, children's laughter floated, distant, uneasy. At her gate, Miss Marple paused. She drew from her pocket a scrap of folded paper, the words from the Colonel's blotting pad she had copied in shorthand when Mrs. Havisham wasn't looking.
"Cannot allow this to go on. The risk is too great."
Clara must... She looked toward the Havisham house, where one upper window still glowed. "Clara must what?" she murmured. "Be warned? Be silenced? Or be forgiven?" Inside her cosy parlour, she laid the note beside her knitting. The fire burned low, and in its crackling she heard again the faint whisper of almonds, the rustle of lace, and the tremor in Mrs. Havisham's hand as she poured tea. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone had written a letter of warning, and someone else had made sure its truth came too late. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the next veil lift, and the shadow beneath grow darker still. Chapter 4. It was the week after Christmas. And though the village of St. Mary Mead wore its prettiest coat of snow, there was little of peace beneath its white stillness. Behind lace curtains and half-closed doors, tongues wagged with quiet vigour. And on the afternoon of the vicarage fête, hastily repurposed from a carol gathering into a comfort social, the hum of speculation was as constant as the rattle of teacups. Miss Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting and an air of gentle disinterest, might have been any sweet-tempered spinster enjoying a little village chatter, yet her blue eyes were as watchful as a cat by the hearth. She knew well that in St. Mary Mead, truth rarely came from the mouth of a policeman, but very often from the lips of someone serving sandwiches. "Of course," Mrs. Linton was saying. Her voice pitched low, but just enough to carry. "It was a most dreadful thing for poor Mrs. Havisham. I can't think how she bears it, what with that niece of hers flitting about like a magpie in mourning."
"They say she's taken to managing everything, even the house accounts." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly.
"A practical young woman," she murmured. "So few are nowadays," Mrs. Linton sniffed. "Practical, yes, but I dare say her practicality will run her into trouble."
"There's talk, you know, of debts. And a man who lent her money." "A London man," Miss Marple nodded faintly, as if the remark were of no consequence. But, in her mind, she pictured Clara Harcourt, proud, striking, and just a little desperate beneath that veneer of poise. "Money matters are so often at the root of unhappiness," she said. "They make one's tea go quite bitter." At that, Mrs. Linton's friend, a plump woman named Mrs. Dawes, leaned closer. "And speaking of tea, did you know the Colonel's punch wasn't the only thing served that night?"
Mr. Ashley, that fiancé of Emily Carter's, helped prepare it. Boasted of some secret ingredient.
"Nutmeg," he said. "Nutmeg,"
Miss Marple repeated mildly. "How festive." "Yes, but the grocer swears he sold none that week," Mrs. Dawes said, eyes widening. "And I heard Mrs. Havisham tell the constable she couldn't find the jar afterward." "Perhaps it walked away," Miss Marple suggested softly. "Things do when one isn't looking." The fete grew livelier as the mulled wine flowed.
A local pianist struck up a tune, and the Reverend's wife fussed about with mince pies.
Through the pleasant chatter, Miss Marple listened for tones rather than words. The nervous laughter of Emily Carter, the forced cheer of Clara Harcourt, the brittle silence of Mrs. Havisham, who sat stiffly near the door. Bull approached the group with a kindly smile. "Such a comfort to see everyone together," she said. "It reminds one how quickly the season passes, and how long some winters can seem." Mrs. Havisham looked up, her expression wan.
"Indeed," she murmured.
"The house feels very empty now."
Even Elsie has gone to her mother's for a few days. Ah, yes, said Miss Marple. A good girl, that one. Honest, I think, though honesty, I've found, often leaves one under suspicion. Mrs. Havisham's lips pressed tightly together.
Clara's gaze darted away. Emily Carter, seated beside her fiancé, attempted a bright remark about the snowdrops that would bloom soon, but her voice trembled slightly. Miss Marple smiled gently. Yes, the first snowdrops are a promise of spring. And yet, she added, they always seem to bloom in graveyards first. Curious, isn't it? A brief silence followed, the sort that falls when too many thoughts rush in at once. Then the vicar's wife called for another carol, and the moment dissolved like sugar in hot wine. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple found herself near the refreshment table. Replenishing the cups, Mr. Ashley, Emily's smooth-voiced fiancé, approached with an easy grin. "Ah, Miss Marple."
"Allow me," he said, taking up the ladle. "It's the least I can do. After all, I've quite the knack for punch-making, haven't I?"
His tone was careless, but his eyes flickered briefly, and Miss Marple saw the faintest strain behind his smile.
"So I heard," she said mildly.
"You added a secret ingredient, I believe?" He laughed lightly. "Only nutmeg, ma'am, a family trick. Gives it a finer aroma." "How interesting," Miss Marple replied.
"I find that even the simplest recipes depend on who's stirring them." He looked at her oddly, as though unsure whether she joked.
"You have quite the wit, Miss Marple." "Not wit," she corrected softly. "Just memory. I recall you said that same thing to Mrs. Linton's nephew last week, about nutmeg improving the flavour."
"He said it made him cough." Mr. Ashley hesitated, then laughed again.
"Villagers notice everything, don't they?"
"Oh, yes," Miss Marple agreed.
"Especially the things people would rather they didn't." By dusk, the fete began to wind down. Candles flickered low in their holders, and the air was thick with the mingled scents of spice and gossip. As Miss Marple gathered her knitting, she caught a glimpse of Clara Harcourt standing by the doorway, speaking in low tones with Emily's fiancé. Their conversation seemed sharp-edged. A quick exchange, a flash of anger, and then Clara turned away, her face pale beneath her hat. Miss Marple watched them quietly. A quarrel between those two could mean much, or it could mean nothing. Yet in St. Mary Mead, nothing was ever truly nothing. On her way out, she paused beside Mrs. Linton again, who was collecting empty cups. "Dear Mrs. Linton," Miss Marple said, "you have such a gift for hearing what others overlook."
"Has there been more talk of that cousin, the one struck from the Colonel's will?"
Mrs. Linton's eyes sparkled.
"Agatha Merriweather?" "Oh, yes."
"She wrote a dreadful letter, apparently."
"Called it an outrage. But she's gone off to Bournemouth to stay with a sister."
"Can't face the shame, poor soul." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "Bournemouth, a curious refuge for the wronged and the guilty alike." The air outside was crisp and still, the last of the daylight fading behind the church steeple. Miss Marple walked home along the narrow lane, her shawl drawn close. Snow creaked underfoot. Her thoughts were as neat as her steps, each placed precisely where it needed to go. The punch, she thought. The letter. The quarrel between Clara and the Colonel. The way Emily's fiancé smiled too readily.
"And now a vanished jar of nutmeg spices," she murmured to herself.
So many flavours, and yet only one that turned sweet to deadly. She reached Hollyhock Cottage just as the church clock struck 6. In her parlour, the fire was low and welcoming. She set down her knitting bag, removed her gloves, and poured herself a small cup of tea, weak, just as she liked it. On her table lay a folded newspaper, the Daily Chronicle, and tucked inside, a small notice she had cut earlier that day. Bitter almond essence, imported, pure and potent, now available by special order at Grover's chemist.
Market Row. She read it once more, then folded it back with care.
Grover's chemist, she murmured. And who, I wonder, placed an order so near to Christmas? She leaned back, her eyes half closed, her mind weaving the pattern together, faint threads of scent and speech and secrecy. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just heard a whisper of the truth, carried on the steam of mulled wine and the soft hum of village gossip. Chapter 5. The first days of January brought a sharp, brittle cold to St. Mary Mead. The holly had darkened, the wreaths drooped on their doors, and the cheerful carols had given way to murmurs of post-holiday weariness. Yet Miss Marple, bright-eyed and brisk despite the frost, knew that hearts were far from resting. Christmas was over, but its poison lingered still. At the village grocer's that morning, she paused to examine a display of sugar loaves. Mr. Potts, the grocer himself, bustled forward with his usual eagerness. "Morning, Miss Marple. Cold one today. Can I tempt you with some spice? Fresh shipment of nutmeg, if you please. Though half the village seems to have lost the taste for it lately." "How odd," Miss Marple said pleasantly, drawing off her mitten.
"Nutmeg is such a comforting scent."
"Reminds one of puddings and peace," Mr. Potts chuckled, rubbing his hands.
"Indeed, though I'll tell you something strange, and just before Christmas someone came in and bought bitter almonds. Haven't sold those in years. I nearly forgot I had them." Miss Marple's hand paused on the sugar scoop.
"Bitter almonds, Mr. Potts? Are you certain?"
"As sure as my name's on the window," he said cheerfully. "A fine lady, well turned out."
"Paid in cash, silver, not notes, and asked for a paper wrapping, not the usual tin. Seemed in a hurry, too, dear me," said Miss Marple, her tone mild. "So few women pay in silver these days. I can think of only two in the parish, Mrs. Linton, who distrusts banks, and Miss Clara Harcourt, who owes them too much." Mr. Potts blinked, uncertain whether to laugh.
"Couldn't say, I'm sure."
"But whoever she was, she looked the part of a lady." Miss Marple smiled and thanked him. "It's always good to know one's grocer is observant. You keep a better watch than most constables." He flushed with pleasure. "Bless you, Miss Marple, though I'd rather watch over fruit than felons." "Quite so," she replied softly. "They're easier to preserve." That afternoon, Miss Marple called at the vicarage, ostensibly to deliver some scones for Mrs. Leonard's charity basket. The Reverend greeted her with a hopeful smile, for he knew that Miss Marple's visits, though never idle, often brought more sense than a dozen sermons. "Come in, my dear," he said, warming his hands at the fire. "You've been following this dreadful business, I suppose." "One can hardly avoid it," she replied.
"Our village thrives on tragedy. It adds spice to otherwise plain lives," he sighed.
"The constable insists there's no proof of foul play. Yet the rumours persist." "As rumours do," she said, seating herself.
"But you know, Reverend, rumours are not quite baseless."
"They sprout from a seed of truth, perhaps very small, but alive all the same." He looked thoughtful.
"You think someone really meant harm?"
Miss Marple's eyes softened.
"Oh, I think harm was meant, but perhaps not to the one who died." She told him, in her gentle, roundabout way, of the grocer's tale, the mysterious lady, the bitter almonds, the cash.
The Reverend frowned deeply.
"If that's true, the poison must have come from those almonds."
"And the lady— Good heavens, Miss Marple, do you mean— "I mean only," she said quickly, "that one mustn't judge too soon. Motives are like recipes, more than one ingredient, and sometimes the cook changes her mind." Later, back at Hollyhock Cottage, Miss Marple found herself visited by Emily Carter. The girl's eyes were red-rimmed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She sat by the fire like someone determined not to cry. "Miss Marple," she began, "they're saying dreadful things about me."
"About George, Mr. Ashley. They think he had something to do with it."
"They say he tampered with the punch bowl." Miss Marple poured her tea and handed her a cup. "People often talk loudest when they are most uncertain, my dear. But it is true, isn't it, that Mr. Ashley took a rather keen interest in the punch?" Emily flushed.
"He was only helping."
"The Colonel asked him to stir it. He was proud of his recipe." "Yes," Miss Marple said kindly.
"I believe he called it his secret ingredient."
Such a romantic phrase, don't you think? It covers so much, from sugar to sin. Emily's lips quivered.
"You don't think he would— You can't believe—" "My dear," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "I believe very little until I have watched everyone twice. Once when they think they are alone, and once when they know they are watched."
"It tells one everything about human nature." She leaned forward, her tone warm but probing. "Did you see who poured the Colonel's glass that night?"
I think it was Aunt Havisham herself," Emily said hesitantly.
"But he asked George to taste it first, just to be sure it wasn't too strong."
"George said it was fine and laughed and then—"
Her voice broke. Miss Marple patted her hand.
"Thank you, my dear."
"You've told me more than you think." When Emily had gone, Miss Marple sat in her chair for a long while, watching the fire die into embers. Outside, the bells rang faintly for evensong, their sound distant and pure.
At last, she rose and fetched a small notebook from her writing desk.
Upon one page she wrote 3 lines, bitter almonds, lady tea paid in silver.
Punch bowl being stirred by Ashley, laid tasted by Colonel.
Teacup, 1 missing from Havisham tray. Then, after a pause, she added another line, who meant to drink the poison? The question sat there, neat and terrible in its simplicity. 2 days later, Miss Marple ventured again into the cold, this time to Grover's chemist in Market Row, the little shop mentioned in the newspaper notice. Inside, the scent of liniment mingled with peppermint lozenges and polish. Mr. Grover, a mild man with spectacles that made his eyes enormous, greeted her at once. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. What brings you out in this weather?" "Curiosity, my dear Mr. Grover," she said sweetly, "the sort that kills neither cat nor conscience."
"Tell me, do you still supply bitter almond essence by special order?"
His brows rose. "Why, yes, we had one such order not long ago."
"I only keep a dram or 2 at a time, you understand."
"It's quite potent." "Indeed," she said. "And may I ask, Subin, who ordered it?" He looked apologetic.
"A lady, I believe."
"Well-dressed, gloves and all." Didn't give her name, but I remember the scent of rosewater. She had a lovely lace handkerchief, embroidered initial, if I recall.
"An H, I think." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How fortunate you notice such details."
"I dare say the world is held together by observant shopkeepers," he blushed. "Oh, I'm sure not, ma'am."
"Though, forgive me, I could be mistaken about the initial."
"My eyes aren't what they were." She left soon after, walking slowly through the snow-dusty street, the twilight soft around her. Rosewater and almonds, it was again that pairing, gentle and deadly. An H embroidered, perhaps for Havisham, or perhaps for Harcourt. It was always the smallest letters that carried the largest truths. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her tea cooling beside her untouched. Her needles moved steadily, though her thoughts darted faster than her stitches. She recalled Mr. Potts's description, a fine lady, well turned out, paying in silver. Then Mr. Grover's recollection, a handkerchief scented with rosewater, the letter H. There was something deliberate about it, as though 2 clues had been planted, one for each name. Clara Harcourt and Helen Havisham, both H's, both capable, both anxious, both bound to the Colonel in inconvenient ways, and one of them perhaps willing to reach for a poison meant for another. When the clock struck 10, Miss Marple set aside her knitting. The fire had burned low, the room filled with that serene hush that comes only to tidy cottages and clear consciences. But her mind was not yet still. She glanced once more at her notebook and traced her finger beneath the last line, who meant to drink the poison? Then slowly she added another, and who changed the cup? The question glimmered like a spark in the fading light. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and soundless, cloaking the village in innocence once more. But innocence, Miss Marple knew, was a surface easily cracked, and beneath it, truth waited like something preserved in frost. She folded her hands, eyes calm and clear. "Well," she murmured, "the recipe thickens." And Miss Marple, smiling kindly,
knew she had just tasted the next note of danger in the Christmas punch. Chapter 6. The snow had ceased.
But frost still clung to the thatched eaves of St. Mary Mead, like lace frozen mid-pattern. Smoke rose thinly from cottage chimneys, and the air smelled faintly of wood ash and damp wool. Inside Hollyhock Cottage, Miss Marple's fire burned bright and loyal, though her thoughts were anything but restful. 3 threads now ran through her mind, the mysterious letter, the bitter almonds and the vanishing teacup. Each thread led inevitably back to the Havisham household, and Miss Marple, who knew that truth hides best among polite silences, decided it was time to visit those silences once more. She dressed for the occasion as she always did, with modest precision. A neat hat, her brooch pinned just so, gloves of soft grey wool. She looked the very picture of harmless gentility, which of course was her greatest disguise. Mrs. Havisham received her with the polite surprise of a woman who has not slept properly since before Christmas. The drawing-room was warm, but the air felt stifled, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Upon the mantelpiece, a row of photographs gleamed faintly in the firelight. Summer scenes, hunting parties, the smiling faces of people who once believed their happiness permanent. "I do hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said, as she removed her gloves, "but I had such a pleasant little errand nearby and thought I might call." "You're very kind," Mrs. Havisham replied, gesturing to the armchair near the fire. "It's quiet here now, you see." Too quiet, perhaps. One begins to imagine footsteps in the hall. "Imagination," Miss Marple said, seating herself, "is a poor servant, but a keen master." The widow gave a weak smile and poured tea with a trembling hand. Miss Marple watched the gesture closely, not unkindly, but as one might watch a faint clue taking shape. The spoon rattled lightly against the cup. Above the hearth, a particular photograph drew Miss Marple's eye. It showed a summer picnic, sunlight slanting through trees, and at its centre, the Colonel, laughing broadly, his hand resting on the shoulder of a woman, not his wife. She leaned forward with the sort of innocent curiosity that only Miss Marple could make sound sincere. "What a charming picture! Was it taken at the church fete last June?" Mrs. Havisham looked up sharply, colour draining from her face.
"No," she said after a pause.
"That was taken at Sanborn when my niece was staying with us. She insisted on a picnic." "Your niece? Miss Harcourt, of course," said Miss Marple. "Such a handsome girl. The camera quite loves her." Mrs. Havisham's cup slipped in its saucer, spilling a few drops of tea. "She was close to my husband, yes. He liked her company." "I should think he did," Miss Marple said gently. "Youth and admiration are a tonic for older men, though sometimes the dose proves too strong." The silence that followed was long and brittle. Outside, a crow cawed once, as if to punctuate the thought. Clara entered moments later, a flush of colour high on her cheeks. She looked lovely, as always, though her eyes carried that sheen of sleepless worry.
"Miss Marple, how good of you to come."
"My aunt so enjoys company," Miss Marple smiled. "We were admiring the photograph of your picnic. Such a charming composition." Clara's gaze flicked to the mantel, and for an instant her expression hardened. "Yes, well, it's a reminder of happier times." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "I do hope you'll forgive me, my dear, but I'm rather fond of pictures."
"They tell so much, don't they? Especially about where people stand." Clara's lips curved faintly.
"You mean who stands beside whom?" Miss Marple's needles clicked quietly in her lap. "Exactly so." The conversation drifted to safer topics. The weather, the vicarage concert, the difficulties of ordering coal. But Miss Marple noticed the way Mrs. Havisham's eyes avoided her niece's, and how Clara's fingers, restless, turned the pages of a magazine upside down without seeing them. After some minutes, Miss Marple rose, murmuring something about checking on the housekeeper. In truth, she wished to see the study again. The door was ajar. Inside, the room remained just as it had been. The faint scent of cigar smoke, the tidy desk, and on one shelf, a row of small silver frames. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the photograph above the hearth. She stepped closer. There it was again, the Colonel's hand resting lightly on Clara's shoulder, but not quite lightly enough. It was an intimate gesture disguised as familiar warmth. Miss Marple's eyes softened, not with judgment, but understanding. Human hearts, she knew, could lead one into very foolish corners. Then she saw something else. In the far corner of the frame, a reflection. The glass had caught another face, Mrs. Havisham's, half-turned, watching. Miss Marple left the study as quietly as she had entered, only to nearly collide with Emily Carter in the hall. The girl started, clutching her gloves. "Oh!"
"Miss Marple, I didn't expect—"
"My dear Emily," said Miss Marple kindly, "you look quite pale."
"Have you been visiting Mrs. Havisham?"
Emily hesitated. "Yes, I came to return a book Clara lent me. I didn't want to stay long." "I see."
"And is your young man well?"
Emily's expression flickered. "George? He's gone to London. Business matters," he said. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured.
"Business at the turn of the year, so how industrious." Emily bit her lip.
People are saying dreadful things.
I know what they think, that George helped make the punch, that he... She stopped, lowering her voice.
But Miss Marple, he couldn't have. He wasn't even near the Colonel when he took that last glass. He was dancing with me. Miss Marple's brows lifted faintly.
Dancing?
Are you quite sure, dear? Yes. The Colonel was with Clara near the window. Near the window, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. That is very helpful, my dear. I'm sure you've told me something quite valuable, Emily frowned. Have I? Miss Marple smiled. Oh yes, more than you imagine. When Emily had gone, Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, where Mrs. Havisham sat dabbing her eyes. My dear, she said kindly, grief is never tidy, is it?
It creeps into all the corners. Mrs. Havisham looked up, her voice trembling. I can't bear this, Miss Marple.
The whispers, the police, the questions.
I feel as though the house itself is accusing me. Miss Marple took her hand gently.
My dear, houses are innocent. It is people who make them guilty, though often without meaning to. Tell me truly, did you ever suspect your husband of affection?
Elsewhere?
Mrs. Havisham's hand stiffened, then relaxed. I suspected many things, Miss Marple, but I never wished to prove them. Ah, said Miss Marple softly, that is a sentiment shared by most wives and most murderers.
Come to that. Mrs. Havisham drew a sharp breath.
But Miss Marple's tone was so mild, so grandmotherly, that the sting faded into perplexity rather than anger. As twilight gathered, Miss Marple took her leave. The snow had turned to fine sleet, whispering against her umbrella. She walked slowly, her thoughts weaving themselves like the neat stitches of her knitting. The Colonel, the wife, the niece, 3 hearts bound by pride, jealousy, and silence. And somewhere in that tangled skein, the poisoned thread wound tight. When she reached home, she placed her gloves on the radiator and warmed her hands by the fire. On her mantel stood her own modest collection of photographs. Family, friends, a young Raymond smiling awkwardly beside her roses. She gazed at them for a moment, then whispered, "Pictures never lie, but they do omit what's inconvenient." She reached for her notebook and wrote, "Photo, hand on Clara's shoulder." Reflection, Mrs. Havisham watching. Colonel's drink poured near window, not from punch bowl. Teacup? The pencil paused. She underlined the last word. Then she set the notebook aside, poured herself a small sherry, and gazed into the hearth. The coals glowed like embers of memory, and perhaps
of guilt. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly,
knew she had just glimpsed not one secret, but 2, burning quietly in the photograph by the hearth. Chapter 7. The new year had crept in quietly, leaving St. Mary Mead half buried beneath snow and suspicion. Each morning the milk froze in its bottles, the church bell tolled faintly through fog, and the gossip, though softer now, had grown more pointed, like a needle finding its thread. Miss Marple, however, had no need of rumour. She was waiting for something else entirely, a detail small enough to hide in plain sight, to reveal itself at last. That detail came, as they so often do, disguised as a polite visit. Emily Carter arrived at Hollyhock Cottage one frosty afternoon, cheeks flushed from the cold and eyes wide with anxiety. She carried herself with the brittle energy of someone trying to outpace a guilty thought. "Miss Marple," she began breathlessly, "I didn't know who else to talk to. It's all so dreadful. Aunt Havisham won't see anyone, and Clara's been behaving oddly. She's taken to burning papers in the grate. Said they were old letters, but I'm not sure." Miss Marple motioned toward the fire, and the tea tray already waiting.
"Good bit, my dear. Sit and warm yourself."
"The world always looks kinder with a teacup in hand." Emily smiled faintly and obeyed. The old china rattled slightly as Miss Marple poured. "There," said Miss Marple. "Tea and truth, both best when served hot." Emily gave a nervous laugh. "You make everything sound so easy. I wish I had your calm." "Calm," said Miss Marple, "is mostly practice and a touch of observation. Now you mentioned Clara, burning letters, was it?"
"Yes," Emily said, twisting her gloves.
"She claimed they were only old notes from my uncle. Silly family matters." But she looked frightened, as if someone might see. "Fear," Miss Marple murmured, "has a way of curling up like smoke and leaving the same smell behind." Emily stared at her. "Do you think she's guilty?" "My dear," Miss Marple said mildly, "I think guilt and innocence both wear lace gloves in this village."
One must watch which hand trembles first. A knock at the door interrupted them.
It was young Constable Evans, stamping snow from his boots and looking abashed to find Miss Marple entertaining. "Beg pardon, ma'am," he said. "Inspector wants me to collect any recollections you might have about Christmas Eve. He says you notice things others don't." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled.
"How flattering."
"Do sit down, Constable."
"And do you take sugar?"
He declined awkwardly and perched on the edge of a chair. "They've been through the Colonel's effects again," he said, "and we found something curious in the pantry at the Havisham place."
"A tray, one of those with painted roses."
"Looked like it hadn't been washed since the night he died. One teacup had a white film round the rim like sugar crystals." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-air. "Sugar crystals, you say?" "Yes, ma'am. Doctor thinks it could be residue, cyanide maybe. Funny thing though, there was only one cup like that." "Only one?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "And the Colonel's cup was broken, was it not?"
Evans nodded. "I dropped when he fell."
But this wasn't his usual cup. Belonged to Mrs. Havisham's tea set. Lovely pattern, gold rim, little violets. "How interesting," said Miss Marple, setting her knitting aside. "And was it on the tray before or after the guests arrived, I wonder?" He frowned. "Hard to say. Could have been used later, maybe after the party." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Or perhaps it was never meant to be used at all." When the constable had gone, Emily sat very still.
"Miss Marple," she whispered, "what does it mean?"
"If the poison wasn't in the punch and if it was in the tea—" "It means, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "that the person who poured the tea chose their target carefully." Emily went pale.
"You mean it wasn't an accident?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple murmured.
"There are few accidents in a house full of secrets. Only substitutions." That evening, unable to rest, Miss Marple wrapped herself in her shawl and took a quiet walk through the village. The moon hung low, round as a coin, and the snow glowed blue in its light. At the Havisham gate she paused. A faint flicker showed through the drawing-room curtains, firelight, and two shadows moving within. She hesitated only a moment before knocking. Mrs. Havisham opened the door herself, her face pale and drawn. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "you shouldn't be out in this cold." "I find cold air clears the mind," Miss Marple replied, "and I confess my mind has been most untidy of late. I came to return the Colonel's hymn book. It was left at the church." Mrs. Havisham accepted it absently. Behind her, Clara appeared, her expression startled, then quickly polite. "Miss Marple, how thoughtful. Won't you come in?"
"I never refuse a warm fire," Miss Marple said kindly, stepping inside. The air smelled faintly of rosewater and smoke.
On the table beside the hearth stood a silver tray, and upon it a teapot and 2 cups.
"Only one was empty." "I interrupted your tea," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Clara gave a brittle smile.
"We were discussing
arrangements."
"There's much to be done." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the tray. "Yes, there usually is, as after a death. Sorting, cleaning, deciding what must stay and what must go. So easy in the confusion, for one cup to be washed and another not." Mrs. Havisham blinked.
"I beg your pardon?"
"Just a passing thought," Miss Marple said.
"I sometimes wonder how many tragedies begin with the wrong person picking up the wrong cup." The silence that followed was heavy enough to make the fire crackle louder.
Clara's hands clenched at her sides.
"You think you know something?" she said quietly.
"I think," Miss Marple replied, "that people tell the truth most plainly when they are trying hardest not to." Clara's face stiffened, then softened again. "You're a very clever woman, Miss Marple." "But cleverness can be dangerous." "Only when mixed with impatience," said Miss Marple, rising. "And I am a patient woman." She gave them both her mildest smile, then took her leave. Back at Hollyhock Cottage, Miss Marple set a single cup upon her own tray, violet-patterned china, the twin of Mrs. Havisham. It had been returned to her long ago after a church tea, and she had kept it ever since. Tonight, though, she looked at it differently. "A pattern repeats," she murmured, "if one knows where to look." She fetched her notebook once more and wrote, with her usual tidy precision, "Teacup on tray to violet pattern, single crystalline rim. Colonel's cup shattered, tea poured by wife or by Clara? Who drank what, and who meant to? Then she drew a small arrow beneath the final line and wrote one more word, switch. The next morning dawned pale and silent. The snow had begun to thaw, dripping from eaves and branches like slow tears. Miss Marple stood at her window watching the melt. "So much looks clearer after frost," she said softly, "and yet the ground beneath is still treacherous." She turned from the window and began to pack her knitting into a small wicker bag. "It's time," she murmured, "to stir the last of the sugar and see who winces." Her reflection in the glass smiled faintly back at her, calm,
Kind and sharp as a needle in the sun, and Miss Marple,
smiling kindly, knew the final thread of the mystery lay not in the punch bowl, but in the teacup on the tray. Chapter 8. The frost had finally begun to retreat from St. Mary Mead, but the chill that lingered in the air had little to do with the weather. Beneath its tidy charm, the village felt uneasy, as though the snow itself remembered what had been done before Christmas had faded. Miss Marple, however, moved through it all with her usual quiet composure. That morning she had written 2 short notes, each sealed with care, and sent them off with young Tommy from the post office. One to the Reverend Leonard, inviting him to tea, the other to Mrs. Havisham and her niece. The wording was simple, polite, and impossible to refuse. By the time the church clock struck 4, Hollyhock Cottage was glowing like a lantern in the grey. The table was laid with fresh scones, lemon curd, and of course Miss Marple's delicate violet-patterned china. When her guests arrived, first the Reverend, then the widow and her niece, the little room filled with the scent of tea and tension. "Such a comfort," Miss Marple said warmly, "to have company on these dreary winter afternoons. I thought we might talk things through together. It's dreadful how misunderstandings grow in silence." Mrs. Havisham managed a tremulous smile. Clara Harcourt, standing behind her, looked more composed than ever, though a muscle flickered once at her jaw. "Miss Marple," said Clara softly, "if this is about my uncle's death—" "My dear," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "it is only about your uncle's death, and perhaps his life as well." The Reverend glanced uneasily between them. "My dear Miss Marple," he began, "surely it's best to let the matter rest." "But it has not rested," Miss Marple said kindly. "It has merely been left unfinished, like knitting dropped mid-row." She poured the tea, her hand steady. The cups clinked delicately, the sound small but sharp. "There were so many small puzzles, you see," she continued. "The letter, for instance, warning that certain truths would come to light before Christmas morning. Rather melodramatic, yet prophetic. And the punch? How strange that only the Colonel suffered when so many drank.
stranger still, the scent of almonds lingering in a teacup that was not his. Mrs. Havisham gasped softly, while Clara's eyes flashed. "You mean to say," she said in a low tone, "that it was tea, not punch?"
"Oh, I mean nothing yet," Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. But the tray told a very different story from the punch bowl. Someone, not the Colonel, not even his wife, was meant to drink from that cup, and someone, I think, switched them. Clara's composure faltered.
"That's absurd. Who indeed?"
Miss Marple murmured. It might help to recall that the Colonel had altered his will shortly before Christmas. A small change, perhaps, but one that favoured his wife and left others rather disappointed. Mrs. Havisham's hand flew to her mouth.
"You think someone meant to poison me?"
Miss Marple's tone was soft, almost apologetic.
"I'm afraid I do."
"The poison, you see, was meant for you, not your husband. He only drank the tea to test the flavour, as gallant men often do." The room seemed to shrink. The clock ticked once, twice, as though marking the moment that truth took its first breath. Clara rose abruptly.
"You have no proof."
"On the contrary," Miss Marple said gently, "I have quite enough. The grocer recalls selling bitter almonds to a fine lady who paid in silver, and the chemist remembers another who smelled faintly of rosewater, with a lace handkerchief marked with an H. Such coincidences are rare."
"My dear, unless one wishes to cast suspicion on another."
"A most clever ruse, except that your perfume was lilac, not rose." Clara's face drained of colour.
"You can't possibly..." Miss Marple continued calmly. And then there was the photograph, the Colonel's hand upon your shoulder, his wife watching from the reflection.
You loved him, didn't you, Miss Harcourt? And when he turned away, when he changed his will in favour of the woman who'd discovered his secret, you panicked. You meant only to frighten her, to send a warning with that letter and a harmless dose of bitterness in her cup. But someone else, someone desperate and clever, saw their chance. Mrs. Havisham stared, trembling.
Someone else?
Yes, said Miss Marple softly.
Emily Carter. There was a rustle in the hallway.
Emily had arrived silently, summoned by Miss Marple's note, but standing now at the threshold, pale as snow. Emily, the Reverend said in surprise.
My dear, you shouldn't. She should, said Miss Marple.
She, more than anyone, deserves to hear the truth. Emily's voice was barely a whisper.
I don't understand. Miss Marple turned her gaze upon her, kind and unyielding.
Oh, but you do, my dear. You were there that night. You saw Clara argue with the Colonel, heard her speak of fear and shame. You saw her slip something into her aunt's cup. I mean, not much, just a trace. And when you saw your chance, you took it. You switched the cups. You gave the poison to the Colonel instead, and in doing so, you ensured your own future. Emily shook her head violently.
No, I didn't mean, I only... Miss Marple's voice was steady, almost sorrowful.
You only wished to protect yourself, and perhaps your fiancé. He'd borrowed money from the Colonel, hadn't he? Money he could never repay. The Colonel meant to expose him, to stop your engagement. So you acted, not from hatred, but from fear. Emily's knees buckled and she sank into a chair.
I didn't want him to die. I thought she'd just be ill.
And then he took the cup. Mrs. Havisham sobbed quietly. The Reverend bowed his head. Only Miss Marple remained still, her expression gentle but firm. When the constable came, quietly summoned by the Reverend earlier, at Miss Marple's request, Emily went without protest. The room seemed to exhale as she left, leaving behind the scent of wilted roses and regret. Mrs. Havisham sat motionless for a long while.
At last, she said in a trembling voice, How did you know, Miss Marple?
Miss Marple folded her hands. Oh, my dear, it was all quite ordinary. A letter with no postmark, a teacup left unwashed, a young girl who looked too frightened of grief. I have learned that where there is fear, there is usually guilt or love. Sometimes both, she smiled faintly. The Colonel was a foolish man in many ways, but not cruel. He drank the tea out of courtesy. It was a small act of gallantry. And the end of him? Mrs. Havisham's eyes filled with tears.
And Clara?
She will keep her silence, I think, said Miss Marple gently.
Her sin was one of foolish affection, not malice.
The world will punish her enough by making her live respectably ever after. Later, when they had all gone and Hollyhock Cottage was quiet again, Miss Marple sat by the window watching the snow melt from the holly boughs. The last of the daylight glowed soft through the frost, turning everything silver and calm. She took up her knitting, her needles clicking gently, a steady rhythm against the hush.
Another Christmas, she murmured. Another lesson in human nature.
Such fragile hearts and such desperate hands. The fire burned low, the flame steady and warm. Outside, a single robin hopped across the garden path, bright against the fading snow. Miss Marple smiled, the kind of smile that held both pity and peace.
Ah, but every darkness in time, she said softly,
finds its light beneath the holly. Candlelight Mysteries channel. And so, dear listener, our tale draws to its quiet close, the flame reduced to a soft and steady glow, the shadows retreating once more into silence. In St. Mary Mead, the air grows calm again, and Miss Marple's knitting needles resume their patient rhythm, each stitch a meditation on human nature, its tenderness, its folly, and its unspoken griefs. Perhaps tonight, as you sit by your own flickering light, you will think of Hollyhock Cottage, of the secrets left upon its doorstep, and of the truth that finally came knocking. For in every mystery there lies not only the darkness of what was done, but the light of what is learned. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Candlelight Mysteries, where every secret is revealed by the soft glow of candlelight. Until next time, dear listener,
Another secret fades.
By Candlelight